Snow fell on the valley like a secret, soft and silent, burying a land already stripped bare by the cold. Out there, alone, the Maid Ranch was a ghost, its roof patched with scavenged tin, its fences leaning like tired old men. Inside, a fire spit more smoke than heat, and a man named Jonas Mackay was trying to coax it back to life. He was a man used to things dying. His daughter Annie, just 5 years old, was fogging up the window with her breath, her little finger tracing patterns that vanished as soon as they were made. Her voice was a whisper against the glass. "Papa," she said, "someone's coming." Jonas got to his feet, every joint cracking a complaint. He was only 35, but grief and debt had a way of aging a man, carving years into his shoulders like rings on a tree. He pulled open the heavy door, and the wind bit at his face. Out on the road, a wagon was creaking through the snow, pulled by a single exhausted mule. A lone figure was hunched on the driver's bench, fighting the wind. It was a woman. Her name was Miriam Hale, and she sat there stiff as a corpse, a threadbare shawl pulled tight around her. Behind her, a single trunk was strapped down, its corners frayed, its wood stained by 100 storms. She pulled the mule to a stop right in front of the cabin, her breath pluming in the freezing air. She just sat there for a long moment, staring at the house as if she wasn't sure the ground would hold her. Jonas watched from the doorway, his eyes narrowed. Wary. He'd made a choice, a desperate one, and now he was wondering what it was going to cost him. Annie peeked out from behind his leg, her eyes wide not with fear, but with a child's simple curiosity. "She's cold, Papa," she whispered. And just like that, the child's words cut through his doubt. He gave a single burdened nod. "Come on in, Ma'am," he called out, his voice rough from not being used much. "Fire's weak, but it's fire." Miriam climbed down, her boots sinking deep into the snow. She grabbed her trunk with both hands. It looked far too heavy for her thin frame, and she staggered with the weight of it. Jonas started to move, to help her, but he stopped himself. He knew that for some folks, pride was the only thing they had left, and offering to help could feel like trying to steal it. So he let her carry it. Let her carry her own burden up the steps and into his house. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and boiled beans, a place of pure survival. Miriam set the trunk down against the far wall with a heavy thud. Her eyes darted everywhere, taking in every shadow, every crack in the wood, as if she was memorizing a map of her new prison. Annie, however, walked right up to her and tugged on her shawl. Miriam bent down slowly, her gaze meeting the little girl's. Annie's hand reached out, and her small fingers curled around Miriam's. Not a word was said, but something passed between them. A current. A silence that was warmer than any fire Jonas could build. He knew the town would talk. Oh, they were already talking. Jonas Mackay, taking on hired help when the bank was circling his land like a vulture. They'd call it desperation. They'd call it impropriety. A widower who couldn't even manage his own home. But Jonas needed more than gossip to keep his daughter fed. He needed another pair of hands, and maybe, just maybe, he needed a voice in the house that wasn't his own echo of sorrow. He cleared his throat. "There's plenty of chores," he said gruffly, "not much pay. I reckon you knew that when you came." Miriam's eyes, dark and deep, lifted to meet his. They didn't flinch. "I knew," she answered, and her voice was soft, but it held the kind of strength that only comes from weathering the worst storms imaginable. She took off her shawl and hung it by the fire. Annie, without a moment's hesitation, climbed right into her lap, as if that's where she'd always belonged. The wind rattled the shutters, a reminder of the cold world outside and what it thought of them. But inside, for the first time in a long, long time, the little cabin didn't feel so empty. Annie giggled as Miriam whispered something in her ear, and Jonas felt a pang in his chest he couldn't name. It was hope and fear and shame all tangled up together. Later that night, as the fire burned low, a phrase from an old sermon came back to him. "God setteth the solitary in families." He hadn't believed it then. Grief had made him deaf to it. But now, with this strange woman's trunk against his wall and her voice mixing with his child's laughter, he started to wonder. Annie's head drooped onto Miriam's shoulder, her eyes heavy with sleep. "Papa," she murmured, her voice drowsy but certain, "she's warm. Don't let her leave." Miriam's arms tightened around the little girl. Her face, lit by the flickering fire, was impossible to read. Jonas swallowed hard, looking away. But he couldn't unhear the words. They hung in the smoky air, a promise and a threat all at once. And in that silence, Jonas knew the real trouble hadn't even started yet. You see, there was something off about Miriam from the very beginning. It wasn't just her silence, or the way she carried herself like a soldier who'd lost a war. It was the trunk. That heavy, weather-beaten trunk she kept against the wall. She never opened it when he or Annie were in the room. He would hear the faint click of a latch late at night, a soft rustling, then silence again before dawn. What was she hiding in there? It was too heavy for just clothes and keepsakes. He imagined gold or stolen silver, things that would explain the haunted look in her eyes. The first trip into town confirmed his fears. The world outside his ranch hadn't softened a bit. Snow was melting into muddy streaks on the ground, but the hearts of the townsfolk were still frozen solid. Jonas hitched the wagon, with Annie and Miriam sitting in the back. Annie was pressed close to Miriam, her hand buried in the woman's shawl. Jonas kept his eyes on the road ahead, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He was driving them straight into the lion's den. The general store was the heart of the town, and its lifeblood was gossip. Men in dusty hats leaned against the counter, their voices dropping to a low hum the second Jonas walked in. He could feel their eyes on his back, sharp and calculating. "Maid took on help, did he?" one of them muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Another man chuckled, a dry, nasty sound. "Help, they call it." The laughter wasn't loud, but it filled the store, thick and suffocating. Jonas's hand tightened on the sack of flour he was holding. He could feel the heat rising in his neck. Miriam, standing just behind him with Annie clutching her dress, heard it too. But she didn't react, not a flinch, not a flicker of emotion on her face. Her shoulders just seemed to straighten a little more, bracing for a blow no one could see. Sunday at the church was even worse. The whispers were like buzzards circling a carcass. The women, with their gloved hands and feathered hats, stared at Miriam from behind their hymn books, their eyes cold and hard. "A man ought to guard his reputation," one of them said, her voice carrying across the pews, "especially with a child in the house." Her friend nodded sagely. "Some men don't mind a little mud, so long as it fills a hole." Jonas heard every word. His ears burned with shame and anger, but he said nothing. He just stared straight ahead, his silence a bitter taste in his mouth. Annie looked up, her face a mask of confusion. She tugged on Miriam's hand. "Why do they look at us like we're wrong?" she asked, her child's voice cutting through the poisonous whispers. The question was so pure, so honest, it was sharper than any insult. Jonas opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. He had no answer for her. It was Miriam who knelt, bringing herself eye to eye with the little girl. "People's tongues can be colder than the wind, little one," she said softly, her voice a strange mix of sadness and steel. "Don't you ever let them freeze your heart." Jonas had to look away. He was ashamed. She had said the words he should have said. She was carrying the burden that should have been his. Back at the cabin, life fell into a quiet routine. Miriam was a tireless worker. She mended Jonas's torn coat with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She scrubbed the floors, cooked their meager meals, and hummed old hymns while Annie drew pictures in the ashes on the hearth. Jonas found himself watching her. He tried not to, but his eyes kept drifting her way. He noticed the way she tucked the blanket around Annie at night, the way she would pause her work just to listen to the child's laughter. One evening, he found her by the fire, mending that same coat. The wind was howling outside, rattling the windows like an angry spirit. "You didn't have to mend that," he said, his voice sounding loud in the quiet room. Miriam looked up, a strand of dark hair falling across her face. "It's what I can do," she said simply. Then, so quietly he almost didn't hear it, she added, "I'd rather do than sit with idle hands." There was no self-pity in her voice, just a weary dignity that made Jonas feel a fresh wave of guilt. Was she working to earn her keep? Or was this something else? Was it a kind of penance? He couldn't figure her out. And the trunk. It was always there, a silent, locked mystery in the corner of the room. One night, when he was sure she and Annie were sound asleep, he crept over to it. His heart was pounding. He felt like a thief in his own home. He ran his fingers over the heavy iron lock. It was cold and unyielding. He tried to jiggle it to find some weakness, but it was solid. He knelt there for a long time, listening to the soft breathing of the two people who had turned his world upside down. What secrets did she carry? What was she so afraid of? The town's judgment was getting worse. It was becoming a physical thing, a pressure he could feel every time he left the ranch. The deacon, a man with a face like a clenched fist, cornered him on the road one day. He leaned on his cane, his eyes like little chips of ice. "A man owes the town an account of his house," the deacon warned, his voice slick with false piety. "You can't just take in a strange woman without answering to God and your neighbors." Jonas's reply was low and tight. "My account is to the Lord, not to gossip." But even as he said it, he felt a knot of doubt in his stomach. A man's reputation was everything out here. And if his name was stained, that stain would spread to his daughter. That night, Miriam was teaching Annie how to fold scraps of paper into little birds. The firelight softened the tired lines on her face. Jonas stood back, watching them, his arms crossed over his chest. Annie's paper bird was wobbly and crooked, but her laughter was pure joy. It filled the small cabin, chasing away some of the shadows. Jonas felt his throat tighten. He wanted to tell Miriam that he saw her. He saw her strength, her kindness. He saw the grace she carried in a world that had shown her none. But the words were stuck somewhere in his chest, tangled up with his fear and his pride. All he could do was watch. He watched as Annie leaned against Miriam, whispering a secret into her ear. He watched as Miriam's hand came up to rest on the child's back. The wind rattled the shutters again, like the town was trying to get in, to tear them apart with its judgment. And as Annie slipped the crooked paper bird into Miriam's hand, Jonas realized something that terrified him. He wasn't afraid of the town's opinion anymore. He was afraid of losing this. He was afraid of losing her. And then the storm came. It wasn't just a storm, it was a living thing, a monster of wind and snow that threw itself against the cabin walls, trying to claw its way inside. The mule brayed in terror from its lean-to. Jonas threw another log on the fire, the sparks flying up the chimney like frantic prayers. The cabin was an island of light in a roaring black ocean. Annie was curled up on the rug by the hearth, her hands stretched out to the warmth. Miriam sat nearby, mending one of his shirts, her needle flashing in the dim light. Jonas sat in his chair, quiet, watching them both. The silence in the room wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with unspoken things. "Tell me a story," Annie murmured, her eyes fighting to stay open. She crawled into Miriam's lap, laying her head on the woman's shoulder. Miriam hesitated for a second, her hand hovering over her sewing. Then she put the shirt down and smoothed Annie's hair. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and steady, like a deep, slow-moving river. "My mother used to say the sparrows never fall without the Lord seeing," she began. "She said if God could notice the smallest bird, surely he wouldn't forget us." Annie's eyes were wide, reflecting the fire. "Did he forget you?" The question was so innocent, so brutal. It hung in the air between them. Miriam took a deep breath. "No," she said softly, "though sometimes I thought he had. But even when the sorrow stays too long, the dawn always comes back." She kissed the top of Annie's head, and the rest of her words were lost in the crackle of the fire. Jonas shifted in his chair. He hadn't prayed in years, not since the day they'd put his wife in the ground. He didn't trust in verses meant for children, but hearing them now in Miriam's quiet voice, spoken not to preach but to soothe, it stirred something inside him he thought was long dead. "You talk like you've carried sorrow same as me," he said, the words surprising even himself. Miriam looked at him across the fire, her face a shifting landscape of shadow and light. "I have," she said, "but sorrow isn't the end. Sometimes it's what teaches you what kindness feels like when it finally comes." She held his gaze, her dark eyes seeing right through him. Annie, half asleep, shifted in her lap. "Stay forever," she whispered. The words just tumbled out, heavy as stone, light as a breath. Miriam's arms tightened around the child, and she looked down, hiding her face. Jonas had to look away, his chest burning. The storm raged outside, but in that small, warm room, something was breaking open. Jonas got up and checked the latch on the door, then came back to the fire. As he knelt to add another log, his knuckles brushed against Miriam's shawl. It was a small touch, but it sent a jolt through him stronger than the wind. She didn't pull away, and for the first time he felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the simple, terrifying warmth of another person. He found himself whispering a prayer, his lips barely moving. Lord, let me not fail her, or this child. Annie stirred again. Papa, she mumbled, don't let the storm take us. Jonas reached out and touched her hair. Storm can't touch us in here, he said, and his own voice sounded different to him. Gentler. Miriam was watching him, her sewing forgotten in her lap. The firelight settled on them, and for a moment the room held something more than just survival. It held a fragile, unspoken hope. As the night wore on, the storm howled, but the three of them were bound together in the small circle of light. Jonas thought again of that preacher's words, God setteth the solitary in families. He had always scoffed at it. But now it felt like a prophecy. Still, he knew the world wouldn't see it that way. To the town, Miriam was an intruder. He was a fool, and Annie was the innocent who would pay the price for their sins. The fire popped, casting dancing shadows on the walls. His eyes met Miriam's over the sleeping child, and in that one look a whole conversation passed between them. An understanding, a shared fear, and a tiny flickering spark of something else. Then Annie murmured in her sleep, one word, soft and clear. Mama. Miriam froze. Her whole body went rigid. Her hands, resting on the child, began to tremble. Jonas sucked in a sharp breath. The storm outside seemed to roar in answer to that single, impossible word. And in the silence that followed, Jonas knew with a cold certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. After the storm, spring arrived like a shy visitor, all mud and grey skies. But the air was softer, and life on the ranch quickened. Miriam moved with the seasons, her hands finding work everywhere. She rose before dawn, her quiet movements a new rhythm in the house. Jonas would watch her from the barn, hanging laundry on the line, while Annie danced around her, and he felt a piece of his own frozen heart begin to thaw. But the town hadn't thawed. Their judgment was a hard, cold knot that only tightened with time. The whispers followed Miriam like her own shadow. The deacon's warnings became more frequent, more threatening. A man cannot stand in two worlds, he'd told Jonas, his cane stabbing at the muddy ground, one before God and the other before shame. Jonas never answered, but the silence was eating him alive. One evening, Annie climbed into Miriam's lap at the supper table. Why don't they like us? She asked, her voice small and wounded. Jonas's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Miriam stroked the child's hair. Some folks only see what they expect to see, she said gently. They forget that hearts can change. And then Annie looked at her father. But Papa says hearts are what God looks at first. The words hit Jonas like a physical blow. The simple, unwavering faith of his own child. He wanted to scream, to ride into town and tell them all to leave him be. But fear was a powerful chain. As the days grew longer, something else began to grow in the little cabin. Annie, in the way of children who follow their own hearts, started to call Miriam Mama. It would slip out when she woke from a dream or in the middle of a game. Each time the word was spoken, it was like a bell ringing in the quiet room. Miriam would flinch, her hands would tremble, but she never corrected the child. And Jonas felt a mix of terror and a strange, fierce joy. The word hung between them, a beautiful, dangerous thing. One night, Annie was drawing at the table. She slid a piece of paper across to Jonas. It was a child's drawing of their house, with 3 stick figures standing outside. One tall, one with long hair, and a small one holding their hands in the middle. That's us, she said proudly. Then she pointed to the figure with the long hair. Thank you, Papa, for bringing me a new mama. The air went out of the room. Jonas gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. Across from him, Miriam's spoon clattered to the floor. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a pain he couldn't understand. For a second, he thought she was going to run. But Annie, oblivious, just climbed into her lap and hugged her tight. Miriam's arms closed around the child automatically, but Jonas could see the tears shining in her eyes. He forced himself to look at her, really look at her, and what he saw in her gaze was a terrifying mix of fear and longing. He was losing this fight. The world was closing in, and his own daughter was leading the charge. The next Sunday in town, the whispers were louder, sharper. "She's playing wife now," a woman hissed behind her fan. "McKay's letting a stray claim his child," a man sneered. This time something inside Jonas snapped. The words were on his tongue, hot and angry, but before he could speak, Annie laughed, a loud, happy, fearless sound that cut right through the hateful whispers. For a moment the gossips were silent, stunned by the pure, uncomplicated joy of a child. Jonas saw it then. He saw how fragile this little world he'd built was. And he knew it wouldn't be enough to just hide anymore. He had to fight. That night, the cabin was thick with everything they hadn't said. After Miriam put a sleeping Annie to bed, she stood by the small cot, her hand resting on the quilt. "She'll keep calling you that," Jonas said, his voice low. Miriam turned, her face in shadow. "I know. What the child believes and what the world allows," she whispered. "Those are not the same thing." Jonas stood up and walked to the fire, the light playing across his hardened features. "I don't care what the world allows," he said, and he meant it. "But I fear what it will cost you, and her." Miriam looked straight at him, her gaze unwavering. "Belonging always costs, Jonas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The only question is who is willing to pay the price." The words hung in the air, a challenge and a plea, and Jonas, for the first time, felt the thunder of an answer in his own heart. He still didn't understand the secrets she carried in her locked trunk, or the sorrow she held so deep in her eyes, but he was starting to understand that it didn't matter. What mattered was the woman standing in front of him. What mattered was the child sleeping peacefully in the next room. And he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his soul, that he was willing to pay any price. Then, one night, he woke to a strange sound. It wasn't the wind. It was a soft, rhythmic scraping coming from the corner where Miriam's trunk sat. He lay still, his eyes wide in the darkness, every muscle tense. The scraping stopped, followed by the faint click of a lock. He heard a soft rustle, the sound of paper, and then a choked sob. A sound of such profound grief it made the hair on his arm stand up. Miriam was crying. He had never heard her cry before. He had seen her tired, seen her brace herself against the world's cruelty, but he had never seen her break. He stayed in his bed, his heart pounding, a silent witness to her private sorrow. He didn't know what to do. To go to her would be to admit he had been listening, to violate the fragile trust they had built. To do nothing felt like a betrayal. The next morning, she was the same as always, quiet, efficient, her face a calm mask. But he could see the faint redness around her eyes, the new tension in her shoulders. The mystery of the trunk was no longer just a curiosity. It was a wound. He had to know. That afternoon, while she and Annie were down by the creek, he went to the trunk. He didn't care if it was wrong anymore. He knelt before it, his hands trembling. He had noticed in the dark where she kept the key, a tiny, intricate thing hidden in a loose floorboard beneath her cot. His fingers closed around the cold metal. With a deep breath, he put the key in the lock. It turned with a soft, grating sound. He lifted the heavy lid. The trunk was filled with worn dresses and a few simple belongings. But underneath it all, there was a small leather-bound book and a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. He picked up the letters first. The handwriting was delicate, familiar. His blood ran cold. He knew that handwriting. He had seen it on grocery lists, on little notes left by his pillow. It was his wife's handwriting, Sarah's. His hands shook so badly he could barely unfold the first letter. It was addressed to "My dearest sister, Miriam." Jonas felt the floor fall away beneath him. Sister. Miriam was Sarah's sister. He read on, his vision blurring with tears. Sarah had written about her illness, about her fear, about her love for Annie. She had written about her husband, a good man broken by hardship, and she had begged Miriam to come, to help look after her child if the worst should happen. "He is proud," Sarah had written. "He will not ask for help, but Annie will need you. Promise me, you will come for her." There were more letters, a dozen of them, each one more desperate than the last. Sarah had been trying to reach her sister for months before she died. But why had Miriam never come? Why had she waited so long? And why had she never told him who she was? He picked up the leather-bound book. It was a diary, Miriam's diary. He opened it to the last entry, dated the week she arrived at his ranch. "I found them," she had written. "I am too late to save my sister, but I am not too late for her child." The deacon intercepted Sarah's letters. He told me she had died of shame, that her husband had cast her out. He told me the child was gone. He lied about everything. He wanted this land, and he used my sister's death to try and scare me away. But I will not be scared. I made a promise. I will not break it. The truth hit Jonas like a physical blow. The deacon, the whispers, the judgment. It wasn't just random cruelty. It was a deliberate, calculated attack. The man had tried to steal his home, his child, his future, and he had used the memory of his dead wife to do it. Jonas closed his eyes, the letters clutched in his hand. Miriam wasn't a stranger. She was family. She hadn't come looking for a job. She had come to fulfill a dying wish. She had been protecting them all along, silently enduring the town's hatred because she had made a promise to her sister. And he, in his blind pride and fear, had suspected her, had doubted her. He felt a wave of shame so profound it almost brought him to his knees. He heard their voices outside, Annie's laughter bright and clear. He quickly put the diary and the letters back, closed the trunk, and replaced the key. He stood up, a different man than the one who had knelt down moments before. The fear was gone. The doubt was gone. All that was left was a cold, hard rage, and a fierce, protective love for the woman who had crossed a country to keep a promise. He knew what he had to do. He would not let them suffer in silence for one more day. The river, swollen with melted snow and days of rain, was a brown, roaring monster. It had jumped its banks, and the water was pouring into the lower pasture where his cattle were trapped. Jonas saw it from the porch, and his heart stopped. Calves were bawling, their cries swallowed by the roar of the water. Annie was clinging to the doorframe, her face white with terror. Miriam was right behind her, her shawl pulled tight, her eyes fixed on Jonas. "I'll fetch them," he said, his voice tight, already pulling on his boots. Miriam stepped forward. "You can't do it alone." He started to argue, to tell her it was too dangerous, but the look in her eyes stopped him. It was the same look she'd had in the church, the same look she'd had in the general store, the look of a woman who would not be broken. She was already tying up her skirts, grabbing a length of rope. "Papa, don't let the water take you," Annie cried. Jonas knelt and pressed his cheek against hers. "Stay here," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "Do as Miriam says." The pasture was a raging torrent. The cattle were huddled on a small patch of high ground, their eyes wild with panic. Jonas waded in, the current grabbing at his legs, trying to pull him under. Miriam was right behind him, the rope slung over her shoulder, her face set in a grim line. Together, they fought their way through the churning water, shouting, pushing, driving the terrified animals toward safety. The water was colder than ice, stealing the breath from their lungs. Jonas saw one of the new calves get swept away, its small body tumbling in the current. Without thinking, he lunged for it. The water surged, rising to his chest, and slammed him against a submerged log. His head went under. Icy water filled his mouth and nose. He was drowning. For a second, he just let the current take him. It was almost peaceful. Then he felt a sharp tug. Miriam, she had the rope. She had braced herself against a tree, her small frame straining against the full force of the river, and she was pulling. Her face was twisted with effort, her feet slipping in the mud, but she did not let go. "Jonas!" she screamed, her voice raw. With one last desperate heave, she pulled him free. He stumbled into the shallows, the half-drowned calf still clutched in his arms, and collapsed on the muddy bank, gasping for air. He turned to look at her. Water was streaming from her hair, her dress was torn, but her eyes were blazing. With defiance, with relief, with a fierce, unwavering strength that took his breath away. And for the first time since Sarah died, Jonas Mackay wept, tears of grief and shame and a gratitude so overwhelming it felt like his heart would break. Annie was screaming their names from the porch, her small voice cutting through the roar of the flood. "Papa, Miriam!" Jonas pushed himself to his feet and helped Miriam up. His hand lingered on her arm. He had to tell her, he had to say the words. "This ranch," he began, his voice cracking, "it needs you." He looked her straight in the eye, letting her see everything. The shame, the regret, the hope. "I need you," he said, the words torn from the deepest part of him. "We both do." Miriam stared at him, raindrops clinging to her eyelashes. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Instead, she took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong, and held on as if he were the only thing keeping her from being swept away. By dusk, the flood had receded and the cattle were safe. Jonas led Miriam back to the cabin, his arm wrapped tight around her shoulders. Annie ran to them, throwing herself first into Miriam's arms, then into her father's. "Don't leave again," she sobbed into Miriam's chest. Miriam held her, her eyes closed, absorbing the child's fear and love like a sponge. Jonas watched them for a moment, then he turned and went to the bed. From a small chest at its foot, he pulled out a quilt. It was patched and worn, the stitches made by a hand he had loved and lost. Sarah's quilt. He unfolded it slowly, the scent of cedar and memory filling the small room. He walked over to Miriam and draped it over her shoulders. His hands rested there for a moment, his rough skin against the soft, worn fabric. It wasn't a replacement, it was a welcome, a gesture that said more than words ever could. "You are not a stranger. You are not hired help. You are home." Miriam looked up at him, her face lit by the firelight, her eyes shining with disbelief and then a slow, dawning acceptance. Annie snuggled under the quilt with her, a perfect, contented smile on her face, as if this was how it was always meant to be. Jonas sat across from them, the fire warming his face, and felt a peace settle over him that he had not felt in years. The world outside, with its judgment and its cruelty, seemed very far away. All that mattered was right here, in this room. He looked at Miriam, and she looked back at him. And in the quiet hum of the cabin, a silent promise was made. A promise to heal, to protect, to build a family from the ashes of their shared sorrow. The next morning, Jonas hitched the wagon. But he didn't head for the fields. He headed for town. Miriam and Annie sat beside him on the bench. He drove straight to the church and stopped in front of the deacon's house. The man came out onto his porch, a scowl already on his face. "McKay," he sneered, "have you come to confess your sins?" Jonas didn't get down from the wagon, he just looked the deacon in the eye. "I know what you did," he said, his voice low and cold as a grave. "I know about the letters. I know you let my wife die alone and afraid, all so you could try and steal my land." The deacon's face went white. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. "And I know you tried to drive away her sister," Jonas continued, his voice rising now, filled with a righteous anger he had never known he possessed. "This woman," he said, putting his arm around Miriam, "is my family, and this ranch is my home, and you and this town will never touch us again." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned the wagon around and drove away, leaving the deacon standing there, exposed and defeated in the morning sun. They didn't stop at the general store. They didn't stop for anything. They just drove back to the ranch, to the small cabin that had become their sanctuary. As they pulled up to the house, Annie leaned her head against Miriam's shoulder. "We're home, Mama," she said. And this time, Miriam didn't flinch. She just smiled, a real beautiful smile that lit up her whole face and kissed the top of the child's head. "Yes, little one," she whispered, "we're home." It wasn't a grand mansion or a fancy wedding. It was just a quiet promise, made in a humble cabin, sealed by a shared struggle and the love of a child. It was a home built not on blood, but on choice, on kindness, and on the courage to stand together against the storm. Which city are you watching our video from? Please let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more. Thank you for watching.